All right, Howard Pinsky, welcome to the show. How are you doing, man?
I'm good. How are you, Jesse?
I'm doing really good. Thanks for taking the time and being here on this episode of Creative Wisdom. Just kind of diving into who you are, what you do, how you got to where you're at in the creative industry, and just as many lessons and as much value as we can kind of glean from you today. That's the whole point. So before we go too far, why don't you just give everybody like a quick Wikipedia bio about yourself? Who are you? What do you do? And how'd you get to where you're at?
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Howard Pinsky. I am currently working at Adobe on the Evangelist team focused on XD. Been here about 3.5 years, I think. But before that, I was working as a contractor on the side, teaching Photoshop for them as well. I was working in a marketing position previous to that. And I worked for Apple at some point. I think things are all over the place. The life is weird right now, but I worked for Apple for a few years, and life has just been an interesting thing to watch evolve. And it's one thing I love talking about because it's one of those things that it's been like a roller coaster. It's been had its ups, it's had its downs. Some of those ups have been very up, some of the downs have been very down. And it's kind of nice looking back, especially on calls like this, looking back at life and kind of reflecting on how I got to where I am today. It's been fun.
That's very cool. Yeah. And so you are currently like on the evangelist team at Adobe and you focus mainly on Adobe XD. Have you always been, I mean, because really, if you look up Howard Pinsky online on Twitter, like on top of having funny, like snarky remarks and all sorts of valuable content and all that kind of stuff, you also just have kind of like you're a natural teacher. So have you always been a teacher? Have you always been interested in helping other people? And how did those things kind of like meld together with the creative industry?
I kind of have. And I was initially going to mention my past as a Photoshop instructor, but it goes much further than that. I remember, I don't know if you remember back in the Neopets days, I was in elementary school, and that was like the big thing back then. And I used to teach some of my classmates on how to do certain things in Neopets. It sounds so stupid, but kind of, when you mention it, I'm like, oh, I guess I was teaching at the time as well. And when I went into grade 12, I was really big into 3D design and animation. We had, I think it was the first year we had a 3D design and animation class. And the teacher who was teaching it, he was absolutely wonderful. I love the guy, still friends with him on Facebook these days. But he didn't really know that application very well. But I had been using it for several years prior to that. So I decided to dive in and start teaching with him. Thankfully, I got a perfect score in that class. But and then in college, I continued that in 3D animation and design. I did have to drop out of college at some point because of that downwards of the roller coaster in life. But I was also helping students learn Photoshop and things like that because again, teachers weren't great. You would expect them to be great in college. They just
Right.
weren't, unfortunately. And then once I left college, I continued that teaching on YouTube. YouTube was brand new at the time, 2006, I believe it was. I'd launched just a year earlier, and I was starting to teach Photoshop. It was me and Nathaniel Dodson. I think we're like one of the first two Photoshop instructors on YouTube, and that was great. And at the time, there was no money to be made on YouTube. It's just a
Right.
platform to upload cat videos and goat videos and boring vlogs, which I tried to do at some point. I'm just not the personality for that. And the Photoshop thing, it worked. It kind of took off for a while, and then naturally kind of led into contracting at Adobe, and now my role as an evangelist.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think there's so much there. Like I had a teacher in kind of like a new media arts like program that I was in for a while in school. And he was good, he was kind of like focused. He would teach us, I think at the time, he taught us how to do like Adobe Flash and like animate in that and like
Oh,
a little bit of
Flash.
Photoshop, a little bit of Illustrator. So it was like kind of just like a shotgun blast, like Adobe slash design class. But then I remember like bumping into him at like a coffee shop, and I was like working, I was going to school full time and like working full time and doing client work at the same time. And I bumped into him. We like sat down at the same table and he was doing like some projects for some people. And it was interesting to see the way he presented himself as a teacher versus how he actually kind of like did his work, like the things he would share and the things he felt like, you're not quite ready for. So, I mean, how do you learn best? Like you are kind of like a natural teacher. Like what's your style of learning? Do you like to watch other people's videos? Do you read books, blogs? What do you do?
Oh, I hate watching people people's videos. No offense, Jesse. But I try not to, only because I don't want to indirectly steal people's personalities, how they
Right.
teach, steal their, and I use this word steal very lightly, but I don't want to take too much inspiration from what they're teaching and how they're teaching. Um, very early on when I started to learn Photoshop, I think I was in elementary school, back before there were layers in Photoshop. Yeah, long ago. I think they were using an outdated version of Photoshop, but still, there were no layers in that application. And then when I started to use and learn 3D Studio Max before going to college, it was all, I had some books here and there because videos really weren't a thing back then, but it was all just diving in and learning. And even today, when I'm trying to learn something new in either XD or any other application that I might be diving into for the first time, I try to just dive in and learn because I kind of expect that the user experience would be good enough to do that. Sometimes that's not always the case, but I really found that I've been a better learner just diving in and doing rather than watching a video and then trying to replicate what I saw.
Right. So you're a learn by doing kind of person. You're a person that
Yep.
would even really promote, encourage other people to, I because maybe I'm kind of that way too. I'm like, hey, I think learning a tool is great, but like project based learning, that's why like I love watching a lot of your videos on XD, or I do some of the XD Daily Creative Challenge kind of things because
Hmm.
I'm like, just open up this file and start pulling it apart. Like as you're learning design, it's one thing to talk about typography. It's another thing to implement it in a design and go, why doesn't this look good? Because you're learning all these ancillary things that are kind of connected to it. So that's the type of learner I am. Sounds like it's the type of learner and teacher that you are.
Yeah, and I think it really allows me and other learners like this to really explore what's possible in an application. And a well, possibly a perfect example is internally whenever we're developing a new tool, especially a very in-depth tool like 3D transforms or component states or whatever it might be. The engineers and the product managers, they have these test kits or test documents where they say, create a rectangle, convert into a component, create a state, make that state red or whatever it might be, and then if it works, great. If it doesn't, file a bug report. I just can't do that because you're kind of following this path, and they've developed it along this path to work in that specific way. But I
Right.
found that if I dive in there and I just go crazy, create things that should not be possible with these specific features, that's where you really start to not only find the bugs, but also, you know, you're 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 um you're starting to explore how you can start to teach these features. And
Mhm.
I found so many bugs, and I found so many weird nuances and edge cases that I'm able to pass on to the engineers and product managers to help them better those features. But aside from that, I can now create these amazing, sample files or tutorials or whatever it might be that stand out from some of the others that might be being released around that same time.
Right. Yeah. No, that's interesting. The concept. It's very meta. Like you're helping to design the design tool, which is like the way that you think about going about and doing that has got to be like pretty complex. And I would agree. I would think that the way to do that is just like try to design rad stuff, try to push the limits of what you're able to create. I've actually seen you create some pretty wild things. I'm like, okay, what the heck? Like now I have to try to like go in and rip this thing apart. Like, how did he figure out how to do that? And I
The
guess you
best
have
is
the
when
motivation to do that.
Yeah, the best is when engineers who build these features send me Slack messages saying, I don't understand how this is even possible. You should not be able to do this in this application. I need this file. And that's when you're kind of onto something and you're kind of using that exploration to do something fun.
Right. That's amazing. Yeah. I think one of the things I'm always interested in, like, especially in like web design or UI design, is I tell people to don't jump to tools too quickly. Like, if you have a concept, an idea, like jump to a piece of paper, a pencil, pen, whatever, because sometimes tools can have complexities and nuances, right? And we have to learn how to use those tools properly. And sometimes those can kind of slow down like creativity. So as you're building a tool, like you're kind of helping build, how are you keeping that in mind? Like how quickly do you want users to be able to jump into the tool? So how do you make the learning curve of that tool simpler? How do you think about those aspects? Because that really is kind of like designing the tool and not necessarily designing the end result that goes on the shelf kind of thing.
It's an interesting question because I when sometimes when a new feature comes out, I've been using it for 3 months, 6 months, sometimes even a year, testing it behind the scenes. So I'm already at that level when it's time for a tutorial to be released, where I'm very advanced and in depth with this feature. So
Right.
I kind of have to remind myself that the people who are going to be watching this video initially have never seen this before, whether it's an application or it's a specific feature. Could be a basic feature, could be an advanced feature. They've never touched it before. So I have to kind of ground myself and release a video that explains it to everybody. Like a grandmother watching should be able to figure this feature out. And what I try to do is release one video that kind of explains it on a high level and then kind of trickle out videos that go a little bit more in depth. Like, here's kind of an overview of the tool, the basics, and then a video where, here, if you really understand this and want to do something cool, here are a few things that you can really do to take it to the next level.
Yeah. So, how do you balance? How does you and your team balance? How do you think we as creatives should balance this idea of designing like tools or experiences or whatever it is you're creating? Whether you're designing a design tool or you're just designing something maybe for a client or for a product, is how do we kind of stay away from the dribble effect, like designing for the flash, right? Designing for the likes, designing for the wow, and designing for usability. Because I was like, I was there. I think I have a video on my channel when like XD first came out, and I didn't know that you should just call it Adobe XD. I was like, okay, I guess this is Adobe Experience Designer, and like I did this. I was like, let's try it out, and it started out like really bare bones, right? It was like there were
Yeah.
shapes, there wasn't even all of the shapes, and so you were like kind of figuring things out. And now there's like 3D transforms and like auto animate and like all this like really snazzy stuff. But it started out like I remember thinking in the back of my head, like, Adobe, like, I think you should have launched with a couple of extra features here, man. Cause like
Mm.
this is pretty bare bones. And I was coming over from like using Sketch and maybe like some other tools. But like, so how do you kind of balance that? Like, hey, functional, usable kind of features or at like way of designing versus flash and pizzazz and like spicy stuff.
I'm definitely guilty of that dribble effect. I would say a lot of the things that I post publicly to Twitter and Dribble definitely fall in that bucket. I
They are
get a lot of
spicy. Listen, you post some pretty dope stuff.
I mean, you kind of have to if you want those likes, which
Yeah.
that's a whole other conversation. Should we be getting those likes? But, I use Twitter and Dribble and Behance as kind of a business platform. So I'm trying to bring in likes and retweets and things like that. But you're absolutely right. That is a big concern these days because you do see a lot of comments that say, okay, this is beautiful, but is it practical? Can I actually develop this? And in some cases, you can because development tools these days have gotten so in depth that they can develop a lot of these very nice transitions and animations. You can use, of course, Lottie and all these sorts of things. But
Mhm.
as teachers and designers, I do think it's our responsibility to kind of take that step back and really explain why something might be usable, why something may not be, why something may be accessible versus not accessible. Especially these days, accessibility is so incredibly important. We need to make sure, many times during my master classes, which I host every Friday on Behance, I try to take the time to explain why whatever I'm designing may or may not be accessible. And sometimes I'll purposely design something that's not accessible and not to be flashy and fancy, but to tell people, I can see exactly what I'm designing right now, the gray on the white or whatever it might be, and many of you in the chat can see exactly what I'm designing, but a lot of people cannot. They may have color blindness, or they may just be getting a little bit older, like I am. My site is definitely not what it used to be 10 years ago, and it's just not as easy to see and read. So it's really our responsibility to teach that. And at the end of the day, if you look at the applications that we use on a daily basis on our phones, Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and Safari and whatever it might be, they're not flashy applications. They're really not. They have a nav bar at the bottom, they have maybe a menu bar and a settings thing at the top, and they have a feed. That's it. And they have a settings, there's a settings page with some toggles. That's it, right? And we're so used to designing these flashy fancy applications with these transitions from one artboard to another that, all these things animate and it looks great. It's not needed for the most part. Sometimes you might want to bump it up a little bit to stand out from all the other applications that exist, but it's really not needed. So again, I think it's our responsibility as designers to kind of push people in that direction. And then once they get there, then kind of trickle in some of the fancier things that you can do, just so that, they have something in their pockets that if they do have an engineering team that wants to push the bounds a little bit, they can.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. It's always that balance, right? That usability, like, but then also, even if you're talking about just generally speaking, like user experience design, like delight is one of those aspects of a user experience. Like, we do want to bring a little bit of delight. We do want people to enjoy using those experiences. But I know that I'm super guilty of it as well. Like, I'll design things and people are like, you know that you are a developer's worst nightmare, right? I'm like, yeah, I know. But this one's I wasn't trying to like take this one all the way through development. So there's definitely a balance there. I'm really interested to know, you just generally speaking, even talking to you right now and just kind of watching your career and all the stuff you make, you seem like a pretty happy dude. You seem to like the position that you're currently at. And I'm always interested to hear any advice that people have for getting to a current season, right? Getting to a season in their creative career, whatever it is, where they really enjoy it. Because I know, like, at the start of a lot of creative careers can be pretty stressful. Like, you're hungry for clients, you don't know exactly what you want to do. You're kind of maybe you're a generalist for way too many years, and finally you realize, like, I just really like web design. So, is there any like key pieces of advice to finding a a season of your creative career that you really love?
Yeah, I think obviously one thing is time. I've been aiming for a position at Adobe for a long, long time. Since I started teaching Photoshop, which was like 13 years ago, it was kind of a dream to teach for Photoshop or teach for Adobe. Um, and a lot of that took time. I kept hearing from a lot of friends at Adobe and now coworkers that it took them years and years and years to finally land a position because they're very sought after, and in many cases they require very specific skills.
Right.
So don't give up on those dreams. There were, I think it was maybe 2010, something like that. So it was over 10 years ago. Adobe ran a contest called, I think, Photoshop's Next Evangelist. And it wasn't a contest to hire another evangelist. I think it was to, just give someone in the community the evangelist title because they produce great stuff. And at the time, I was really deep into teaching Photoshop. So I figured, this is it. This is my in. I'm going to win this competition. I'm going to put so much effort into this thing. And back then, I wasn't going by Howard Pinsky. I was still the Iceflow Studios username that I was, because I wasn't ready to really, I was showing my face from time to time. I think people knew that I was kind of Howard because I said it once in a while. I was still this username. So I entered this competition. I went in there thinking, this is it. I'm winning this thing. I didn't. And it was absolutely heartbreaking at the time because I was so sure of myself. I was so darn cocky that I was going to win this competition and I didn't. And I think that was the best thing that ever happened to me in terms of my professional career because it really punched me in the face and told me, listen, you're not all that you think you are, and you have a long way to go. You need to stop with the username. No one knows who you are. You need to come out as Howard Pinsky, be more professional, stop being cocky, and then just push forward slowly. It's not a race. You're like, I think at the time I was like 22, 23, something. I was very young. Um, and that's what I did. So I took a step back and, I took it slow. I became a little bit more professional. I went to more conferences. I made sure that people knew who I was. And eventually it led to where I was today. And also, I would say explore other areas. There are a lot of areas. We live in an interesting time for designers where, back in the day, it was you were a designer, you were a graphic designer. That was kind of
Right.
the thing. That was it. There wasn't really user experience designers. There weren't really user interface designers. It was all kind of bucketed in one little thing. And in some cases companies had these titles or had these roles, but it was still just designer. But now we have all sorts of different designers these days. And I really encourage people to explore everything that's out there. I was so sure I was going to be a graphic designer using Photoshop and Illustrator, whatever it might be. And then I pivoted. I was incredibly certain I was going to be a 3D designer and animator. And then I pivoted back to Photoshop because I love that. And then I really found the user experience and user interface world. And that kind of took me in whole new directions because I loved the challenges that those areas brought to the table. Figuring out why something, like going back to what we were talking about earlier, why something may or may not be usable, figuring out the right flows and all this fun stuff. And that really got me excited about, XD and all these other applications and working for Adobe and everything. So definitely explore everything and then kind of figure out what you really love and then narrow it down from there and then kind of push yourself in that direction.
Yeah. No, I think that's wise because I think so often um, it does. Sometimes it feels like the tools that we get accustomed to using tend to dictate what's possible with our creativity, right? I mean,
Yeah.
think about a sculptor, think about somebody who builds houses or an architect or something. It's like, what do I have at my fingertips to like create? Like, what tools are available to me? Those tend to be the things I try to like create. So my first kind of foray into design was I hate to say it, I'm super embarrassed, but I had a bootleg copy of Photoshop 7. And
There you
I
go.
just started making because I was in bands. I started making punk rock posters with like way too much like gritty grunge texture and drop shadow. And they were all like super atrocious and awful. But I was like, okay, here's what I love and here's the tool I know how to use. So let's bring them together. And as I started learning more tools, like the way I thought about problem solving and what I found to be interesting creatively kind of shifted. So first it was like print design, then web design, and then web design led me into code, and code led me into, oh, okay, like now I'm doing it all. And now I really love user interfaces. I love user experiences. So it kind of led me into that realm. And who knows? I don't know what I'm going to be doing like 10 years from now. Maybe
Oh gosh, no.
I'll fall in love with designing for like virtual reality or augmented reality. That's a totally different space. And I have no idea, but I'm a big fan of kind of building like skills like on top of each other. So, I mean, what do you think about like, as far as like tools go, creativity and experience, like how do you kind of build things? And I mean, you kind of said with patience, but is there more to that? Like, do you have to constantly be learning? I guess is what I'm asking. Do you have
Oh,
to
you
constantly be
absolutely do.
learning, or can you hit a point where you're like, I have my set of skills, let's just keep honing that set and not learn any new ones? What do you think
Oh,
about
no, no, no. You have to learn new skills. If you had told me 10 years ago that I would be focused on user experience and user interface design, I'd be like, first of all, what the heck is that? And then two, I doubt it because I'm so focused on whatever I was focused on 10 years ago. And we don't even know. We probably can't even figure out what is going to be the big thing 10 years from now. Again, iPhones, for example, right? These things, um, we couldn't even picture what they would be 20
it?
years ago.
Changed the game, right?
It did. And there's so many different examples I can probably give, but technology is accelerating at such a speed that it's going to be unrecognizable to us, 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now. We can't even think about it. And we have to be ready for that. Like you mentioned virtual reality, even though that stuff is very very early these days, and I know there's a lot of controversy about meta and metaverse and all these things. As designers, we have to be ready for that because it could be it could be nothing, but it could be a massive thing 5 years, 10 years from now, right? Um, and we may not necessarily have the tools that are specifically made to create those experiences at the moment, but we have tools that can kind of help us get to that point and get us ready for that point. You know, um, we kind of know that when you have an AR headset or a VR headset on, you're going to be able to look around and you'll be able to maybe swipe things or teleport to different locations or communicate with some sort of chat in such a way. So we can now start building out some of those elements in our kind of flat 2D worlds
Right.
that maybe when the time comes, we'll have this knowledge about how these experiences kind of look and function that we can then kind of take that step in that direction. And I think it goes further than that because I know you can kind of um, see this kind of happening in the NFT and crypto world. There's
Mm,
a massive influx of 3D design out there. You know, you go to Foundation or OpenSea or any of these other NFT platforms, you see a lot of 3D stuff. And I think as designers, especially thinking about the fact that we're going into the AR and VR world, 3D is going to be massive in the
right.
next 10 or 15 years. I mean, it's already a big industry now, but I think it's going to be even bigger because we're going to have designers like ourselves kind of getting into that world. And I do really think that 3D is going to become more accessible and easier to develop than it is
Mm,
today. You know, you have pretty decent tools like Blender and ZBrush and 3ds Max and that sort of thing, and it makes it pretty simple. But I think we're going to get to a point where it's going to be even easier. We'll be able to take our phones, and again, you can do this now, but we'll be able to take our phones and like scan an object just by walking around it.
right.
They have some basic applications now that do that, but it's going to become even easier. And as designers today, we're probably going to have to do things like that in 5 or 10 years.
Yeah.
Of course, there will be specific positions that focus on that, but it's just like you mentioned. You code at some point. I do a little bit of coding too because it does help me understand the world of what web designers do or what iOS
Right.
designers do. So I think we're going to have to dabble in that world as with the 3D world as well.
Yeah, I think so too. I think what's interesting to me though is you're right. Technology is moving so fast. As a creative, I do need to keep learning so that I don't turn into a fossil. I don't turn into like a dinosaur and just go, wow, this whole NFT 3D thing. If everyone could just make Web 2.0 websites like I'm used to, like let's get back to the good old days. I don't want to be that guy, but I'm always concerned with because I have like shiny object syndrome. I'm not sure about like when I watch one of your
Hmm.
videos and you put something out, I'm like, ooh, you know what I would love to do on a Saturday? It's like tear his file apart, put it back together because I don't want to make stuff because I get shiny object syndrome. But I
Hmm.
also have to worry about like balancing my life a little bit. So you're a busy guy, right? You have to balance the current tools and features and creativity you have now. You have to be looking into the future, experimenting, pushing the boundaries. You're also creating content like crazy, and I'm pretty sure you have a family. So how do you balance all of those things? Because I have the danger of being like a very unbalanced person and just following my passions and creativity, and I could stay anchored here researching and making cool stuff all day long, but at a certain point I have to say, okay, that's a great stopping point for today. So how do you kind of control that balance things in your life?
Not well, if I'm being honest. And I think it's important to be honest because
Yeah.
I think a lot of designers or professionals or anybody really, uh, I think we're all kind of falling into this bucket of not being able to balance things properly. I was recently, about a year and a half ago, diagnosed with ADHD, which I kind of figured I had, but when I actually finally saw a psychiatrist and they started asking me questions and really allowing me to dive deep into my past, I'm like, now it all kind of makes sense. And I
Mm.
tried the medication thing for a while. It sent me kind of spiraling into this weight loss journey, which I don't need to lose any weight. I was down to like 135 and I'm almost 6 feet tall, which is not
Wow.
healthy. I was way too skinny. So I'm still trying to figure that out to see what works best. But balancing is difficult because, like you said, I have so many things going on, not just with work, but I have a family. I have a 5-year-old daughter, and we want to take her to soccer, and we want to take her to ninja class, or I forget what it's called. There's this new thing that we're about to take her to, where it's like basically gymnastics, but on another level. Because
Okay.
she has so much damn energy, I can't keep up with her. But you got to figure out how to balance all this stuff, and I don't do a good job at it. I really don't, and I'm still trying to figure that out. But one thing that's kind of helped is creating a bit of a schedule, which is difficult with when you have ADHD because
Right.
even though I have a schedule and I have, like, let's say Monday I'm working on assets for a video, and then Tuesday, this is of course aside from meetings. Tuesday I might be recording a reel for Instagram, and Wednesday I'm doing this or whatever. But then as I'm sitting here mindlessly creating assets on Monday for an upcoming video, an idea comes up. What if I create this thing that looks like 3D but isn't 3D? Aha, I'm going to do that. And then I spend the next 3 days doing that. Then I get distracted. And then I go in so many different directions. And then because I have all these stupid ideas built up in my head, it's 9 o'clock at night. I'm sitting in bed with my wife watching something on Netflix. my computer on my lap and I'm making that stupid 3D thing in a 2D application that I thought would be the greatest thing in the world, then I'm like, it's not what I thought in my head, because that's what we do as designers, right?
Right,
So I
right.
wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't want to fake an answer here and say, oh,
No, it's good. I
I'm the
appreciate
most
it.
balanced person in the world. I've got everything together. I don't. And I'm still working on that. And maybe someone who's listening to this podcast will, maybe they've been there and they've figured something out. Maybe they'll tweet it at us. I don't know. But I'm still looking for that answer.
I just appreciate the transparency because I feel like so often, right? Like we see the Howard Pinsky putting out cool stuff. We see the Howard Pinsky with the beautiful setup. We see Howard Pinsky just crushing it and smiling and like, hey, I'll see you next time. But like, and same thing, like people like accuse me of that all the time. And I'm like, dude, I don't have it all together. I'm still
Hmm.
figuring it out. So maybe just normalizing the fact that it's okay to not have it all figured out, but be works in progress. Like maybe that's like, I think it's a good thing, because there's
It
just
is. I
too many
think,
people writing books and claiming to have it all together. And I'm like, does anybody not have it together like me? Okay, Howard's on my team. Good to know.
yeah. And I think social media plays a massive role into that misconception that we're all happy and fans. I am a very happy person, but of course, we all have our struggles. We have our, relationship struggles. We have our personal struggles. We have our financial struggles. But of course, we don't post those things online because they're
Of
not
course.
they're not interesting. I mean, they might be interesting to some people, but for the most part, they're not. And we don't necessarily want people to know about our struggles. I do post them from time to time to kind of ground not just myself, but also let people know that you're going to struggle as a designer. You're going to struggle as a person, but it does get better if you start, continue to work at things. But every single tweet I put out there, every single dribble post I put out there, I meticulously look at every detail of it to make sure that it's not going to be taken the wrong way. It's not going to make me look bad. And in most cases, we should be doing things like that, but in some cases, we kind of got to let loose sometimes and tell
Right.
people who we really are and what we're really struggling with.
Well, this content that you've helped me create today, I think is super valuable. People are going to just get tons of like value, inspiration, motivation from it. Also just a little bit of encouragement, I think that like it's normal to be going through ups and downs. It's normal to not
Hmm.
have it all figured out. So for me, that was super encouraging. I cannot thank you enough for just taking the time and being here today, Howard. Thanks so much.